The following occurred in September of 2021. I live in an extremely remote area. So remote that what takes place near the end of this story drew no attention from anyone whatsoever. On a Tuesday night at approximately 9:30, I went out my back door and stepped onto the small porch to say goodnight and check on my dogs, which were in their kennel up against the back of the house. As I stepped out onto the porch, I almost immediately heard a voice or voices. I couldn't tell if it was one or two men, but I clearly heard at least one male voice. It appeared to speak about one or two sentences, and although it was relatively loud and clear, I couldn't make out a single word that was said. It was coming from the northeast corner of the property, uphill around 200 yards away. Several things about this struck me as odd. First off, my dogs are livestock guardian dogs, and their breed barks at everything. Secondly, as I mentioned, I live in a very remote area on many acres of land. I regularly go days or longer without seeing anyone. To hear voices coming from the back of my property at 9:30 at night is unheard of. And that's when the beeping started. My first thought, aside from why are my dogs not reacting to this, was that it must be hunters on my property and they are using some sort of electronic device, perhaps to attract elk or deer or whatever they were hunting for. I thought this was strange because I would think if you were hunting you would want to be as quiet as possible and not using something that makes electronic beeping noises. My second thought was maybe it was an animal that was tagged and being tracked by Fish and Game, and that it was wearing a collar that was low on battery power and beeping. The pattern was 5 quick beeps, approximately a 7-second pause, then 5 quick beeps. My next thought was something on my property was in an alarm state. The only items on my property that could possibly make such a sound was my well and my solar equipment. I quickly checked the solar shed and it was silent. My well was further away, towards the back of the property, so I went inside and gathered up a few things to go check the well. While inside, I called my girlfriend, who was 2.5 hours away that night. I wanted to explain to her what was going on and that I was going to check into it. I put a headlamp on, grabbed a night vision monocular, and a rifle with a night vision scope. I went out the back door and the beeping was very loud and close. 5 quick beeps, 7-second pause. I noticed my dogs seemed almost drugged. They were very lethargic. This was very unlike them. I tried to offer them both a treat, which normally they would immediately consume, and I couldn't even push it into their mouths. They wanted nothing to do with food and instead cowered and looked frightened. Again, for this breed, this is unheard of. This actually angered me. Who or what was having this effect on my dogs? I turned and started walking towards the well tank, which was about 40 to 50 yards away. The closer I got to the well, the more obvious it was that this repetitive beeping was not associated with it, and was actually now coming from my right towards the eastern fence line. The eastern edge of my property borders state trust land. It is hilly and surrounded by a barbed wire fence. As I got closer, the beeping became louder. The fence line is as follows. My fence, about a 6 to 8 foot gap running north-south to allow horses to transit the area between my land and the state trust land, and then the state trust barbed wire fence. I was still under the impression that this was most likely a tagged animal, so I tried as hard as I could to walk towards it as silently as possible. I soon realized this wasn't going to be the case. No matter how slow or careful I was, each step was loud. The grass and twigs were simply too dry to move through silently. Just on the other side of the fence were a few junipers and pinon trees, maybe 30 to 35 feet away. The beeping was clearly coming from those few trees directly in front of me. I used my headlamp and both my night vision optics, but could see nothing. No eye shine, no movement, no shadow, nothing. I quickly pulled out my phone and recorded this video of where the sound was coming from. The phone video didn't capture the beeping very well, so I switched to my audio recorder app and recorded the following clip just to prove to others that this wasn't in my head. The second set of beeps in this recording has clearly moved further away and is quieter, but I didn't see or hear anything move. I was frustrated at not being able to see what was obviously right in front of me, so my next thought was to flank whatever it was while heading to the area where I first heard the man or men's voices. I was at the fence line facing east, so I turned to my left and headed north to get to the northeast corner of the property. I reached the corner, stepped over the fence, and onto the gravel road that runs downhill west-east. My thought was to walk east so that the spot where I heard the beeping would be to my right, due south of me. At least that's what I was expecting. Instead, as I slowly walked east on the road, listening to my right for the beeps, they appeared on my left on the other side of the road I was walking on and just a little in front of me. This made no sense, as whatever was making the sound would have had to have covered more ground than I did to get to the road and cross it ahead of me, and be on the land to my north by the time I reached the gravel road. By this time the beeping was very loud and close. I walked about 200 yards down this road, again using my headlamp and night vision optics to scan the area to my left as I did. The beeping seemed to move ahead of me at the same rate I moved. I finally stopped. The beep stayed right in front of me to my left and stopped moving when I did. There was a tree line about 15 feet off the road, and I could tell the beeps were coming from right behind those trees. I stood there in the dark and scanned this area with night vision and regular light for several minutes. Again, I could see nothing that would make this noise. It just repeated relentlessly. 5 beeps, 7-second pause. I pulled up my phone and made another audio recording. In this recording, you can tell the beeping is extremely close to me. At this point, although I was now almost certain this was no wolf or elk with a GPS locator on it, I had to be certain. The beeping seemed to be about 30 feet in front of me, so I raised my AR-15 and fired 2 rounds into the dirt about 15 to 20 feet in front of me, directly in line with the source of the beeps. Instead of an animal taking off through the desert brush and trees, the 5 beeps went off again, but with a different frequency. It seemed higher pitched and just different. Then the 7 seconds passed and the beeps were again where they were before I fired the rifle. At this point I knew 2 things for certain. It wasn't an animal and it wasn't a hunter. There was one large tree directly in front of me and the beep seemed to be coming from directly behind it. I raised my rifle and using the night vision scope, centered that tree in my sights and fired directly into the trunk. The same thing happened. The beeps changed frequency and pitch, then returned to what I guess you would call normal. It was at this point where I realized that whatever this was, it was invisible, moved in absolute silence, and had no fear of being shot. I was about 200 yards down the road, so I turned and headed back towards my property. I reached the northeast corner of my property and stepped over the fence. All the while, these beeps continued. 5 beeps, 7 seconds. But it at least appeared that they were staying in that location 200 yards down the road. That is, until I had almost reached my house and realized that the beeps were again directly behind me. I went to my dogs and they were still timid and lethargic. They acted the way a dog acts when it knows it did something bad and you're about to find out about it. They were huddled together in their structure when normally they just lay down in the dirt out in the open. They never barked once. The beeping at this point is getting to be extremely annoying. I fired bullets at this thing, and not only did it not run off, but it followed me back to my house. At this point, I believe I had fired a total of about 7 rounds, both into the dirt, into the air, and into that tree. Yet still, these beeps followed me all the way back to my property. I went inside and again called my girlfriend to update her on what I had just experienced. Her suggestion was that I go up onto the roof to get a better view of the property. I loaded a fresh magazine, gathered my 3 light sources and my rifle, and climbed onto the roof. At this point, the beeping was very loud. I was on the east side of the roof facing north. The beeping was coming from the northeast behind several trees maybe 50 yards away. I again used all 3 light sources and scanned the area the beeps were coming from over and over for what seemed like several minutes. At times, the beeps would go off, then the 7-second pause, then the next series would be fainter and to the west of their main position, then 7 seconds and back to that tree line again. I was really getting annoyed at this point and decided to send a barrage of gunfire into those trees. I fanned left and right, unloading approximately 18 rounds in maybe 3 to 5 seconds. After the last shot, I sat there on the roof looking into the tree line and listening. 5 more beeps, 7 seconds. I scanned the area of the sound again with my night vision for a few minutes, fired several more rounds at the noise, then climbed down the roof, went inside and updated my girlfriend again. I told her it sounded like Fallujah as I dumped rounds towards the beeps, and yet it never moved. I was frustrated at this point. Went back outside to check on the dogs again, all the while hearing 5 beeps, 7 seconds, over and over again. I noticed suddenly that the source of the beeps shifted position, from the trees to parallel to and due east of the house. At this point, I did what I should have done from the moment I knew it wasn't a hunter or an animal with a tracking device. I prayed out loud to Jesus of Nazareth for whatever this was to depart. The beeping then got quieter, further away, and moved south. Within a few minutes, they were gone, and as of this writing, haven't returned. Judging from the time I first heard the voices and the beeps started, to the point that they left, I estimate the entire encounter to have lasted just shy of 2 hours.